I was racing down the highway, my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard, my knuckles turned white. My phone had just alerted me that my 100-year-old father, a decorated World War II veteran, had collapsed. When I called my wife of 40 years, Diane, she answered with a breathless, panicked voice, promising me she was already by his side in the emergency room. She begged me to drive safely and take my time. But when I sprinted through those hospital doors, the charge nurse pulled me aside with a deeply confused look. She leaned in and whispered that I was the very first family member to arrive. My father had been brought in by a neighbor. My blood ran cold. I sat in the sterile waiting room and opened the security camera app on my phone to check my father's house. What I saw on that glowing screen completely shattered 4 decades of marriage and forced me to orchestrate a revenge so cold my family never saw it coming. Before I dive into exactly what they did and how I made them pay, tell me in the comments where you are watching this story from today. Be sure to like and subscribe if you believe that greed is the quickest way to destroy a family. It was a brisk Tuesday afternoon in mid-October. I had just left the local hardware store picking up some supplies to fix the porch railing at my father George's farmhouse. I am Bruce, 70 years old, a retired structural engineer who spent his entire life building solid foundations for skyscrapers across the Midwest. I always believed in structurally sound things, whether it was concrete pillars or my own family. But that afternoon, the foundation of my life developed a massive, irreparable crack. I was idling at a red light when my phone suddenly blared an emergency tone. It was the automated alert from the medical necklace my father wore around his neck. My chest tightened. At 100 years old, George was remarkably lucid, a tough old soldier who still read the daily paper and managed his own morning coffee, but his body was undeniably frail. I immediately dialed my wife Diane. We had been married for 40 years. She had always portrayed herself as the devoted daughter-in-law, the woman who handled the holiday dinners and the family social calendar with immaculate precision. The phone rang twice before she picked up. Her voice was trembling, pitch perfect in its performance of absolute panic. "Bruce," she gasped, the sound of her heavy breathing filling the car speakers. "I came over to check on George and found him on the living room floor. He was so pale. I called the ambulance right away. I asked her where she was, my heart hammering against my ribs. I am already at the hospital with him," she insisted, her voice breaking just right. "We are in the emergency room. They are checking his vitals now. Please, Bruce, do not speed. He is stable. Take your time getting here. We have everything under control." I told her I was 10 minutes away and hung up. At the time, her insistence that I drive slowly felt like the caring plea of a worried wife. I had no idea it was a calculated delay tactic. I did not take my time. I pressed the accelerator to the floor, weaving through traffic with a desperation only a son fearing for his father's life could understand. When I pulled into the hospital parking lot, I abandoned my truck in a loading zone and sprinted through the sliding glass doors of the emergency room. The air smelled of sharp antiseptic and stale coffee. I rushed to the main desk, my breath ragged, and gave the intake nurse my father's name. "I need to see George," I said, my voice echoing in the quiet waiting area. "My wife Diane is already back there with him." The nurse, a kind woman whose name tag read Carla, typed the information into her computer. Her brow furrowed in confusion. She looked up at the waiting room, then back at her screen. "Sir," she said, her voice dropping to a cautious, hushed tone. "Your father is in curtain 3, but I think there is a misunderstanding." I stared at her, the adrenaline still coursing through my veins. "What do you mean?" I asked. "Is he all right? Where is my wife?" Nurse Carla leaned over the high desk and lowered her voice to a whisper. "Mr. Bruce, your father is resting and stable, but you are the very first family member to arrive. He was not brought in by his daughter-in-law. He was brought in by a neighbor who heard his medical alarm through the screen door." My mind hit a brick wall. The words simply did not compute. I pulled out my phone and looked at the call log. It had been less than 15 minutes since Diane swore to me she was sitting right beside his hospital bed. I thanked the nurse and walked mechanically over to a row of plastic chairs in the waiting area, my knees suddenly weak. The relief of knowing my father was stable was instantly eclipsed by a dark, suffocating wave of confusion. If Diane was not here, where on earth was she? I sank into the uncomfortable chair, the fluorescent hospital lights buzzing above me. My engineering mind, trained to solve complex structural failures, began to process the data. Diane had lied. She had lied with a practiced, breathless panic. Why would a woman lie about being at a hospital with her dying father-in-law? There was only one logical place she could be. My father's farmhouse. George lived on a historic 50-acre property just outside the city limits, a beautiful stretch of land that had been in our family for 3 generations. A few months ago, I had personally installed a smart home security system there to monitor the property, just to ensure he was safe when I could not be around. I opened the app on my phone. My hands were shaking so badly, I typed in the wrong password twice. When the live feed finally loaded, the crisp, high-definition video of my father's living room appeared on my screen. I stared at the phone, my blood turning to ice. Diane was there. But she was not alone. Standing right beside her was our 45-year-old son, Brian, and his wife, Rachel. Brian was dressed in his expensive tailored suit, pacing nervously, while Rachel stood by the window, peeking through the blinds like a lookout. Diane was pointing urgently toward the heavy oak rug in the center of the room. They had not gone to the hospital. They had used my father's collapse as an opportunity. They had used it to get me out of the house. I zoomed in on the video feed, holding the phone inches from my face. Brian shoved the heavy rug aside, exposing the hardwood floor beneath. My stomach churned with a sickening realization. They were standing directly over George's vintage floor safe. It was an old iron vault built into the foundation itself, holding family heirlooms, important documents, and most crucially, the original deed to the 50-acre estate. I watched in absolute horror as my son, the boy I had raised, coached in baseball, and handed my entire life's work to knelt on the floor with a crowbar and a drill. Everything clicked into place with devastating clarity. 5 years ago, I had retired and handed over my highly successful commercial construction firm to Brian. I thought I was passing on a legacy. But Brian did not have my work ethic. He liked the title of CEO, the luxury cars, and the country club memberships, but he despised the grueling early mornings and the hard math. Over the past 2 years, I had heard whispers from old colleagues that the firm was hemorrhaging money. Brian had taken on massive debts to fund his lifestyle, masking the company's financial rot. Diane and Rachel, both obsessed with appearances and high society status, were enabling him, terrified of losing their lavish lifestyles. I watched through the small digital window as Brian finally popped the heavy iron lid open. Diane reached inside, pulling out a thick manila envelope. Rachel clapped her hands together in silent celebration. They were not a family responding to a medical emergency. They were vultures picking at a man before he was even dead. They had let my 100-year-old father lie on the floor, suffering just so they could steal the deed to his land to bail out Brian's catastrophic failures. They thought they had outsmarted me. They thought I was just a tired old man who would blindly believe his wife's tears. But as I sat in that hospital waiting room watching them loot my father's legacy, my shock evaporated. It was replaced by a cold, calculating rage. I closed the app and slid the phone into my pocket. I would not confront them today. I would not scream or shout. Instead, I was going to let them believe their plan worked flawlessly. I was going to use their arrogant confidence to build a financial guillotine, and when the time was right, I was going to let the blade drop. The emergency room was a symphony of beeping monitors and hushed voices. I walked past rows of pale curtains until I reached bay number 3. My father George lay on the narrow hospital bed. He looked incredibly small, swallowed up by the thin white blankets. This was a man who had stormed the beaches of Normandy, a man who had built a life with his bare hands out of sheer willpower. Seeing a patch of white gauze taped over his temple made my chest ache with a heavy, agonizing sorrow. I pulled up a plastic chair and sat beside him. The rhythmic hiss of the oxygen machine was the only sound in the small space. I reached out and took his hand. His skin was paper-thin, cool to the touch, and mapped with purple veins. But his grip, when he squeezed my fingers back, was surprisingly firm. George slowly opened his eyes. They were a faded blue, cloudy with age, but still sharp with a quiet intelligence. He blinked against the harsh fluorescent lights and offered me a weak, crooked smile. "You look worse than I do, Bruce," he rasped, his voice dry and scratchy like old parchment. I poured him a small cup of water from the plastic pitcher on the bedside table and helped him take a sip. I told him he had given me the scare of my life. The doctor had already assured me it was just a mild concussion and a bruised hip. But looking at him, I knew how easily things could have ended differently. I asked him how he was feeling, trying to keep my voice steady. I wanted to ask him a million questions about Diane, but I knew I had to be gentle. I asked him to walk me through what happened this morning. I asked if he had tripped on the edge of the hallway rug again. My father let out a heavy sigh and let his head sink back into the pillow. He stared up at the ceiling tiles for a long moment before he spoke. His mind was perfectly clear, untouched by the fog of his 100 years. He told me he did not trip. He said he had been sitting in his favorite armchair reading the morning paper when a sudden wave of dizziness hit him. It was a familiar feeling, a warning sign from his old heart. He said he called out for Diane, who was in the kitchen fixing a cup of tea. She came into the living room, and he told her his chest felt tight. He asked her to grab his emergency medication from the counter. "It was right there, Bruce," he whispered, looking directly into my eyes. The little orange bottle was sitting right next to the coffee maker. She just had to hand it to me. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. I asked him what Diane did next. George swallowed hard. He told me she walked over to the armchair, but she did not have the bottle in her hands. She just stood over him. He said he reached his hand out, begging her to get the pills, because the room was spinning and the edges of his vision were going dark. She looked down at him with a completely blank expression. She did not panic. She did not rush to the kitchen. She just watched him. My father, an old soldier who had faced down enemy fire, looked terrified as he recounted the moment. He tried to stand up to get the medicine himself, but his legs gave out. He collapsed, hitting his head hard against the corner of the heavy wooden coffee table before slumping onto the floor. He told me the impact left him disoriented and unable to move. But he was not unconscious. He could hear everything. He lay on the hardwood floor, helpless and bleeding from his temple, expecting his daughter-in-law to kneel beside him or scream for help. Instead, he heard the beep of a cell phone keypad. He told me Diane stepped right over his legs and made a phone call. She did not dial emergency services. She called Brian. My father's voice cracked as he remembered the words she spoke. He heard her tell our son Brian, "Get over here right now. He is down, and I need you to bring the tools." I felt the breath get knocked out of my lungs. My wife of 40 years, the woman who slept beside me every single night, had intentionally let my father suffer. She had watched a 100-year-old man collapse in agony, and her first instinct was to call our financially ruined son to come pry open a safe. A sickening wave of guilt washed over me. I had provided everything for my family. I had given Brian a thriving construction business, and I had given Diane a life of absolute comfort. And this was my reward. I had unknowingly funded my own betrayal. They had grown so accustomed to luxury that they viewed my father not as a human being, but as a final obstacle standing between them and a massive payday. My father looked at me with tears pooling in his faded blue eyes. He asked me why she would do something so cruel. He asked what Brian needed to bring tools for. I could not tell him the truth right then. I could not tell a man who was lying in a hospital bed that his own grandson was currently robbing him blind. I squeezed his hand and forced a reassuring smile I did not feel. I told him he must have misheard her due to the concussion. I told him everything was going to be perfectly fine and that he was safe now. But inside, my heart had turned to stone. The woman I married was a monster, and the son I raised was her willing accomplice. They had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. I promised my father I would handle everything. As I sat there holding the hand of the man who raised me, I knew my marriage was over. There would be no shouting matches, no tearful confrontations, and no couples counseling. They wanted a war over money and property. I was going to give them one, but it would be a war fought entirely in the shadows until it was time to burn their world to the ground. I left the hospital parking lot as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, jagged shadows across the asphalt. The drive back to our suburban home felt like a journey through a parallel universe. Just a few hours ago, I was a man who believed he had a loving wife and a successful son. Now I was a man driving a vehicle filled with ghosts. I gripped the leather steering wheel, letting the smooth texture ground me in reality. My mind, a machine built to calculate stress loads and structural integrity, went to work on the architecture of my own ruined marriage. If I walked through the front door and demanded answers, Diane would simply deflect. She would cry and twist the narrative. She would tip off Brian, and they would scramble to cover their financial tracks. I could not afford to be an angry husband. I had to be an architect. I had to design a controlled demolition. I pulled into the driveway and parked my truck next to her pristine silver sedan. The house looked exactly the same as it had this morning. The manicured lawn, the expensive outdoor lighting, the carefully curated facade of a happy, affluent family. It made my stomach turn. I unlocked the front door and stepped into the foyer. The scent of her expensive lavender perfume hung thick in the warm air. The house was quiet, but not empty. I took off my jacket and hung it on the wooden rack, moving with slow, deliberate steps. I had to play the part of the exhausted, relieved son. I heard the soft shuffle of footsteps coming from the upstairs hallway. Diane was making her descent. She walked down the carpeted stairs, wearing a soft beige sweater and a perfectly distressed pair of jeans. Her makeup was slightly smudged, an intentional touch to convey distress. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and she held a crumpled tissue in her hand. It was a masterful performance. If I had not seen her pointing a greedy finger at my father's floor safe through a security camera just an hour ago, I would have believed every single tear. "Oh, Bruce!" she cried out, her voice trembling with an expertly crafted fragility. She rushed across the hardwood floor and threw her arms around my neck. She buried her face in my shoulder and let out a dramatic sob. I stood there, letting her hold me. My arms hung heavy at my sides for a moment before I forced them to wrap around her waist. The physical contact made my skin crawl. Holding her felt like holding a venomous snake, but I patted her back gently. "I am so sorry," she whispered against my shirt. I was at the hospital, sitting right there in the waiting room. I just went down to the cafeteria to get a cup of coffee to calm my nerves. When I came back, the nurse told me you had already been there and gone. I was so frantic I just drove straight home, hoping you would be here. The lie flowed from her lips like smooth water. She did not stumble over her words. She did not hesitate. She had rehearsed this story on her drive back from my father's farmhouse after looting his safe. I pulled back just enough to look into her eyes. I arranged my face into a mask of pure, loving relief. I reached up and gently wiped away a stray tear from her cheek. "It is okay, Diane," I said, keeping my voice soft and steady. "You do not need to apologize. I know how terrifying it must have been for you to find him like that. You did the right thing calling the ambulance. You saved his life." I watched her pupils dilate slightly. She absorbed my validation, drinking it in like a thirsty animal. She actually believed I was buying her story. She let out a long, trembling sigh and leaned her head against my chest. "I was so scared, Bruce," she murmured. "He just looked so fragile on the floor. I thought we were going to lose him today." My jaw clenched so tightly, my teeth ached. She was standing in our luxurious foyer, wearing clothes bought with my hard-earned money, shedding crocodile tears over a man she had intentionally left to die. The sheer audacity of her evil was staggering. But I nodded softly and stroked her hair. "He is tough," I replied. "He has a mild concussion, but he is completely lucid. He is going to be just fine." I noticed a microscopic flinch in her shoulders when I used the word lucid. She knew that if George was lucid, he might remember exactly what happened. She pulled away slightly, keeping her hands on my chest. "Did he say anything to you about the fall?" she asked, her tone innocent but probing. "Did he remember how it happened?" I gave her a tired, reassuring smile. "No," I lied smoothly. "He was pretty confused about the whole thing. The doctor said his memory of the moments right before he hit his head might be completely blurry. It happens often with falls at his age." Diane released a breath she had clearly been holding. A look of profound relief washed over her face. She patted my chest and offered me a weak, loving smile. "Well, thank goodness he is in good hands now," she said. "We will have to make sure he gets the best care when he comes home. Or maybe we should finally start looking into that assisted living facility we talked about. He clearly cannot be left alone anymore." The audacity was breathtaking. She was already laying the groundwork to remove him from the farm entirely. If they put him in a facility, they could sell the 50 acres without any interference. I walked past her and went into the kitchen. I needed a glass of water to wash down the bitter taste in my mouth. Diane followed me, her heels clicking softly against the tile floor. She leaned against the marble island, watching me pour the water. "I brought you some leftovers from dinner," she said, pointing to a covered plate on the counter. "You must be starving after sitting in that hospital all afternoon." I thanked her and took a long drink of the cold water. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to slam the glass down, to grab her by the shoulders and tell her I saw everything. I wanted to scream that I knew about Brian. I wanted to drag her back to the hospital and make her look my father in the eye. But a premature confrontation would only give her the upper hand. She would deny it. She would call Brian, and they would move the assets they stole from the safe. I looked at her leaning against the marble counter. 40 years we had shared this life. We had taken vacations to the coast. We had celebrated anniversaries and hosted neighborhood barbecues. We had raised a son together. I wondered when the woman I married had turned into this calculating stranger. Or perhaps she had always been this way, and I had simply been too busy working, too busy building my company to see the rot spreading beneath the surface. I realized that my success had been a comfortable shield for her greed. As long as the money was flowing, as long as her status was secure, she could play the role of the perfect wife. But the moment Brian's failures threatened her lifestyle, she was willing to sacrifice my father without a second thought. I thought about the thousands of hours I spent on construction sites, working through weekends and holidays, to ensure my family had everything they could ever want. I had poured my sweat into the foundation of our life, and she was tearing it down out of pure selfishness. I walked over to the counter and picked up the plate of food she had left for me. I looked at her and gave her a warm, appreciative smile. "Thank you, Diane," I said. "I am incredibly lucky to have you. You handle stress so well. I do not know what I would do without you." She smiled back, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "We are a team, Bruce," she said softly. "We always will be." I turned around and put the plate in the microwave. "We are a team." The words echoed in my mind, twisting into a dark promise. I watched the yellow light of the microwave spin the plate around and around. In that quiet, ordinary kitchen moment, I made a vow. I was going to let her sleep comfortably in my bed. I was going to let her drink my wine and spend my money for just a little while longer. I would play the role of the aging, oblivious husband. But behind her back, I was going to dismantle her entire world. I would not just divorce her. A simple divorce would mean splitting my assets, giving her half of everything I had built. No, I was going to bleed her dry. I was going to let her and Brian walk right into their own trap. I would secure my father's legacy, and I would leave Diane with absolutely nothing. The microwave beeped, signaling that the food was ready. I took the plate out and sat at the dining table. Diane poured herself a glass of red wine and sat across from me, chatting idly about a charity event she was supposed to attend later that week. I nodded and ate the food, tasting absolutely nothing. The gears in my mind were already turning, locking into place. The blueprint for her destruction was drawn. The silent adjustment had officially begun. The morning sun poured through the kitchen windows, painting the granite countertops in a warm, deceptive light. Diane stood by the espresso machine dressed in her crisp white tennis skirt and a pastel yellow polo shirt. It was Wednesday. For the past 15 years, Wednesday meant a morning tennis match at the country club, followed by a 2-hour luncheon with her socialite friends. She hummed a soft tune while pouring her coffee, completely unbothered by the fact that my father was currently lying in a hospital bed with a bruised skull. I sat at the kitchen table nursing a black coffee, playing the role of the exhausted, overwhelmed husband. She walked over, kissed the top of my head, and told me to rest. She promised she would visit George later that afternoon. I simply nodded and told her to enjoy her match. I listened to the rhythmic click of her tennis shoes walking toward the garage. The heavy wooden door shut. The engine of her car purred to life and slowly backed down the driveway. I waited exactly 5 minutes watching from the front window until her car disappeared around the bend of our quiet suburban street. The second she was gone, the tired old man routine vanished. My posture straightened. My mind shifted into absolute focus. A burning question had kept me awake, staring at the ceiling all night. What exactly was inside that thick manila envelope Brian and Diane had pried out of my father's vintage floor safe? George kept a lot of history in that old iron vault. War medals, birth certificates, old family photographs. But Diane and Brian were not sentimental people. They would not leave a bleeding man on the hardwood floor to steal photographs. They were looking for leverage. They were looking for salvation. I needed to know the exact depth of the financial rot infecting my family. I turned and walked down the hallway toward my home office. My office had always been my sanctuary. The walls were lined with framed blueprints of commercial buildings I had engineered over a 40-year career. I knew every beam, every load-bearing wall, every structural joint of those skyscrapers. I knew how to distribute weight to prevent a collapse, but I had blindly neglected the structural integrity of my own household. For 4 decades, I had handed my paycheck over to Diane. I focused on the concrete and the steel. I let her handle the household bookkeeping, the investments, and the daily bills. It was a silent agreement we made early in our marriage to keep the peace. Diane loved control. She loved managing the wealth. She thrived on moving numbers around and ensuring our outward appearance was flawlessly affluent. I hated paperwork. I trusted her implicitly. That was my most catastrophic failure as an engineer. I never inspected the foundation of my own life. I walked over to the heavy mahogany desk she used for the household accounts. Diane was a meticulous woman. She did not leave bank statements lying around. Her files were color-coded and locked. But I had built this house. I knew its secrets. I knew that she kept a small brass key hidden inside a hollowed-out decorative book on the top shelf of the library. I retrieved the key and unlocked the bottom drawer of her desk. The drawer slid open smoothly, revealing perfectly organized manila folders. Tax returns, utility bills, insurance policies. Everything looked completely normal on the surface. But a trained engineer knows that catastrophic failures hide beneath the surface. I started pulling out the folders one by one, cross-referencing the account numbers. It took me 20 minutes to find the anomaly. It was a separate, locked, leather-bound ledger pushed all the way to the back of the drawer, underneath a stack of old warranty manuals. I placed the heavy leather book on the desk. My hands felt strangely cold as I opened the cover. The pages were filled with Diane's neat, looping handwriting. Rows and rows of dates, account numbers, and massive monetary figures. I traced my finger down the first column. It was a record of my primary retirement account. The nest egg I had broken my back for working 60-hour weeks in the blistering summer heat and freezing winter winds. I stared at the balance. It was wrong. It was horrifyingly wrong. Hundreds of thousands of dollars were missing. I flipped the page, my breathing growing shallow. She had systematically liquidated my mutual funds, my stock portfolios, and the emergency cash reserves. Month after month, year after year, money was being siphoned out in careful, strategic amounts to avoid triggering fraud alerts with the bank. I looked at the destination columns to see where my life's work was bleeding into. The funds were not being spent on jewelry or luxury vacations. Every single unauthorized transfer was routed to an obscure limited liability company. I recognized the address listed next to the company name. It was the same commercial address as my old construction firm, the firm I had handed over to our son Brian 5 years ago. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together with sickening clarity. Brian had not just mismanaged the company, he had driven it straight into the ground. He had taken on massive, toxic corporate debts to fund a lifestyle he did not earn. When the creditors came knocking, he did not man up and face the consequences. He went to his mother. And Diane, terrified of losing the social prestige of having a wealthy, successful son, had quietly opened the veins of my retirement accounts to keep his sinking ship afloat. She had stolen from my future to subsidize his failure. I thought about Brian as a little boy. I remembered taking him to job sites, showing him how pouring concrete the right way mattered. I tried to teach him that integrity was not just a structural requirement, but a moral one. I paid for his college without him needing a single loan. I gave him a thriving business with loyal clients and a spotless reputation. But he had squandered it all on flashy sports cars, expensive dinners, and a desperate need to look important. Rachel, his wife, was just as complicit. She thrived on the country club gossip and the designer clothes, completely blind to the fact that her husband was a fraud. They were two empty people pretending to be giants. And when the walls started closing in, they did not choose to work harder or downsize their lives. They chose to steal from a 70-year-old man and a 100-year-old war veteran. I sat back in the leather chair, the silence of the house pressing down on me. I flipped to the final pages of the ledger. The most recent entries were frantic. Brian's debts had outpaced my liquid assets. Diane had drained almost everything I had accessible. The well was running dry. The firm was on the verge of total bankruptcy and total public humiliation. That was why they needed my father's safe. That was why they needed me out of the house. My father's 50-acre historic estate was fully paid off. It was a pristine, untouched asset worth millions of dollars to the right commercial developer. The envelope they stole did not contain cash. It contained the original deed to the land. They were planning to leverage my father's property to cover the final crushing wave of Brian's corporate debt. They were willing to render a 100-year-old war veteran homeless just to save their own fragile egos. A profound, heavy sadness washed over me, followed instantly by a wave of cold, calculating rage. I looked at the framed blueprints on my office walls. I had spent my life building things that were meant to last. I had provided everything a family could ever ask for. I bought Diane the house of her dreams. I gave them a life devoid of financial struggle. And in return, they viewed me as a foolish old workhorse, a bank account attached to a heartbeat. They thought I was too tired, too old, and too trusting to notice the floorboards rotting beneath my feet. They thought they could strip my father of his legacy and leave us both with nothing. I did not tear the ledger apart. I did not throw the book across the room or smash the lamp on the desk. An emotional reaction was exactly what they would expect if I found out. But I was not going to give them the privilege of my anger. I pulled my phone out of my pocket and systematically photographed every single page of that ledger. I captured every date, every stolen dollar, every fraudulent transfer route to Brian's shadow company. I made sure the lighting was clear and the numbers were sharp. When I finished, I closed the leather book. I placed it back in the bottom drawer, exactly where I found it. I stacked the old warranty manuals on top, closed the drawer, and turned the small brass key. I wiped down the desk to ensure not a single speck of dust looked disturbed. I walked the key back to the library and slipped it inside the hollowed-out book. I walked back to the kitchen and poured the rest of my cold coffee down the sink. My reflection in the kitchen window stared back at me. I looked like the same 70-year-old man who had woken up that morning. But everything inside me had shifted. Diane and Brian thought they were playing a game of simple theft. They did not realize they had just invited an engineer to inspect their work. They were building their salvation on a foundation of lies, forgery, and elder abuse. I was going to let them build it as high as they wanted. I was going to smile at my wife when she came home from the country club. I was going to ask my son how the business was doing. I was going to watch them celebrate their stolen victories. And when they finally stood at the very top of their fragile tower, I was going to detonate the pillars and watch them fall. I knew my own limitations. I was an engineer, a man who understood the rigid laws of physics and the predictable nature of concrete and steel. But I was navigating a landscape of human deception, a world where the rules were constantly shifting and the foundation was built on lies. If I started snooping around Brian's office or asking questions at his bank, the shockwaves would reach Diane instantly. She was too hypervigilant, too deeply entrenched in her own survival to miss the signs of my suspicion. I needed someone invisible. I needed a professional who could trace the dirty money and map out the exact coordinates of my son's desperation without leaving a single footprint. I reached out to a private investigator, a former forensic accountant I had used years ago to vet suspicious contractors. We met in the back corner of a quiet diner on the edge of town, a place where nobody from Diane's country club circle would ever set foot. I handed him an envelope containing the photographs I had taken of Diane's hidden ledger, the names of Brian's shadow companies, and the security footage from the living room camera. I told him I needed to know exactly what Brian was doing every hour of the day, and I needed to know what was inside the manila envelope they had stolen from my father's floor safe. The investigator nodded, sliding the envelope into his briefcase. He promised me a full report by the end of the week. Those waiting days were the most agonizing test of my patience. I had to sit across from Diane at the dinner table every night chewing my food and listening to her complain about the minor inconveniences of her day. I had to nod sympathetically when she sighed and talked about how stressful it was managing the household while George was recovering in the hospital. She played the role of the weary, burdened matriarch to absolute perfection. I played my role just as well. I rubbed my temples, pretending that the stress of my father's fall was causing my memory to slip. I asked her the same questions twice. I left my keys in the refrigerator. I wanted her to feel incredibly secure. I wanted her to believe that my mind was deteriorating under the pressure, leaving her completely free to execute whatever sinister plan she had set in motion. 4 days later, my phone buzzed with a simple message from the investigator, telling me the package was ready. I drove to a nondescript office building downtown, parking my truck 2 blocks away to ensure I was not followed. When I sat down in the investigator's cramped office, he did not offer me coffee or pleasantries. He simply slid a massive binder across the desk. His face was grave, a grim reflection of the toxic waste he had spent the last 96 hours wading through. He told me that my son was not just drowning in corporate debt, he was completely submerged and gasping for his final breath. Brian had leveraged every single piece of heavy machinery, every company vehicle, and the very building the construction firm operated out of. But that was not the piece of information that made the blood freeze in my veins. The investigator tapped a manicured finger on a specific tab in the binder. He told me that Brian had recently held 3 off-the-books meetings with a notoriously aggressive commercial real estate developer. I opened the binder and flipped to the designated tab. Staring back at me was a high-resolution photocopy of a legal document. The bold, heavy letters across the top read, "Durable Power of Attorney." I felt a cold, heavy stone drop into the pit of my stomach. I read through the dense legal jargon, my eyes scanning the paragraphs that granted the bearer absolute unchecked authority over the principal's medical decisions, financial accounts, and real estate holdings. The principal listed on the document was my 100-year-old father, George. The agent granted this godlike authority was my son, Brian. I moved my eyes down to the bottom of the page to the signature line. There, sitting in dark blue ink, was my father's signature, alongside the stamp of a public notary. I stared at that signature for a long time. George had a very distinct way of writing his name, a rigid cursive style drilled into him during his military service a lifetime ago. But the loops on the capital letters on this page were too smooth, too perfectly rounded. My father had arthritis that made his hands tremble, causing his real signature to look sharp and jagged like the edge of a broken saw blade. The signature on this legal document was a flawless forgery. Diane had spent 40 years signing birthday cards, checks, and school permission slips. I knew the natural curve of her handwriting anywhere. She had carefully studied my father's old documents and painstakingly forged his name, giving our son the legal authority to steal a dying man's entire life. The investigator leaned across the desk and delivered the final crushing blow. He explained that Brian was not just trying to cover a few missed loan payments. He was orchestrating the immediate rapid sale of my father's 50-acre historic farmhouse. The commercial developer he was meeting with specialized in bulldozing historic properties and throwing up cheap, densely packed suburban subdivisions. Brian was preparing to sell the land for a fraction of its true value in exchange for a massive immediate cash buyout to save his failing company. The developer knew Brian was desperate and was taking full advantage of the bleeding firm. They were rushing to finalize the sale and close the deal before my father could be discharged from the hospital, or before I could intervene. Brian and Diane needed my father locked away in a cheap assisted living facility, not for his safety, but to ensure he was not home when the bulldozers arrived to tear down the house he had built with his own 2 hands. I closed the heavy binder, the sound echoing in the quiet office like a slamming cell door. The sheer scale of their depravity was almost impossible to comprehend. They were not just stealing money, they were erasing my father's legacy. They were willing to destroy the very soil where I learned to ride a bicycle, where my mother had planted her rose bushes, where generations of our family had gathered for Thanksgiving dinners. They were going to pave over a century of history to pay off the debts of a cowardly son who was too lazy to work for his own living. I thanked the investigator, paying his invoice in cash, and walked back out into the bright afternoon sun, carrying the heavy binder under my arm. The rage I felt was no longer hot or chaotic. It had crystallized into something incredibly dense and freezing cold. Diane and Brian believed they held all the winning cards. They had a forged document, a desperate buyer, and a perfectly constructed narrative of a failing old man. But they were operating under the fatal assumption that I was still the blind, trusting husband who would gently step aside. I unlocked my truck and placed the binder on the passenger seat. I knew my next move. I could not fight a forged legal document with sheer anger. I needed someone who operated in the mud. I needed a lawyer who specialized in dismantling elder fraud, a ruthless architect of legal destruction who could help me turn their fraudulent paperwork into a one-way ticket to a federal prison. I started the engine, the low rumble vibrating through the steering wheel, and pulled away from the curb. The silent adjustment was moving out of the shadows, and I was ready to prepare the trap. The air was thick and heavy as I drove to the industrial side of the city to meet the man who would help me dismantle my family. I parked my truck in a gray concrete parking garage far away from the polished glass towers where corporate lawyers usually operated. Mr. Reed did not have a flashy office with a view of the skyline. His practice was located in a drab brick building tucked between a dry cleaner and an abandoned warehouse. This was a man who did not care about optics or country club memberships. He cared about winning. He was a bulldog, an attorney who specialized exclusively in elder fraud and financial exploitation. I needed a street fighter who knew how to navigate the darkest corners of human greed, and walking through the heavy wooden door of his office, I knew I had found one. Mr. Reed sat behind a massive steel desk cluttered with towering stacks of manila folders. He was a broad-shouldered man in his mid-50s with sharp, observant eyes and the worn, tired face of someone who spent his life wading through toxic family disputes. He did not offer me a warm greeting or a comforting cup of coffee. He simply pointed to a rigid leather chair across from him and told me to sit down. I appreciated his bluntness because we did not have time for pleasantries. I placed my heavy leather briefcase on his desk, unzipped it, and began to pull out the pieces of the trap my wife and son had built for themselves. I started with the photographs I had taken of the hidden ledger. I laid them out flat on the cold steel surface, detailing how Diane had systematically drained my retirement accounts to cover Brian and his failing construction firm. Mr. Reed reviewed them in absolute silence, his eyes tracking the massive unauthorized transfers moving from my life savings into Brian's shadow companies. Next, I pulled out a small black flash drive. I told him it contained high-definition security footage of my wife and my son prying open my 100-year-old father's floor safe while he lay bleeding in a hospital emergency room. Finally, I placed the crown jewel of their deception on the desk. It was the high-resolution copy of the forged, durable power of attorney, granting Brian absolute control over my father's medical and financial life. I sat back in the heavy leather chair and waited for his reaction. I expected him to sigh or shake his head in disgust. I expected him to warn me about how difficult this would be to prove in court. Instead, a slow, terrifying smile spread across the face of Mr. Reed. It was the smile of a predator who had just spotted a crippled deer wandering into an open field. He picked up the copy of the forged power of attorney and examined my father's forged signature. He leaned back in his chair and let out a harsh, dry laugh that echoed in the small office. He tossed the paper back onto the desk like it was a worthless piece of trash. Mr. Reed looked me dead in the eye and told me that my wife and son were absolute fools. He explained that a forged power of attorney was certainly a serious crime, but in this specific scenario, it was completely legally worthless. I leaned forward, feeling a wave of confusion, and asked him to explain. He opened a secure database on his computer and pulled up my father's property records. He reminded me of a conversation I had with my father more than 20 years ago. Decades prior, when my mother passed away, my father and I had sat down with an estate planner. We wanted to protect the 50-acre historic farmhouse from predatory scammers and aggressive property taxes. We had taken the entire estate and placed it inside an ironclad, irrevocable trust. Mr. Reed explained the rigid mechanics of an irrevocable trust. My father was the primary beneficiary, but he did not legally own the property anymore. The trust owned the property. Furthermore, I was the sole named trustee. This meant that absolutely no one could sell, mortgage, or alter the 50-acre estate without my explicit legal authorization. A standard power of attorney, even a legitimate one, held absolutely no weight over an irrevocable trust. Diane had spent hours perfectly forging my father's signature to steal a piece of land that my father did not even have the legal authority to sell. They had stolen a deed that was essentially just a commemorative piece of paper. The reality of the situation washed over me like a cold, refreshing rain. Brian had taken this forged, worthless document and used it to initiate a multi-million-dollar commercial real estate transaction. Mr. Reed leaned forward, resting his thick forearms on the desk. He explained that Brian was currently negotiating with a ruthless commercial developer. If Brian accepted any money, signed any preliminary contracts, or attempted to finalize a sale using that forged document, he would not just be committing elder abuse. He would be committing massive federal wire fraud and grand larceny. He would be taking hundreds of thousands of dollars from a powerful corporate entity across state lines in exchange for absolutely nothing. I asked Mr. Reed if we should contact the developer and stop the sale before it progressed any further. The bulldog smiled again and slowly shook his head. He told me that stopping them now would only result in a messy domestic dispute. Diane would cry and claim she forged the document out of panic over Brian's debts. Brian would play dumb and say he did not understand the legalities of the trust. They would hire expensive defense attorneys and drag the process out for years, bleeding my remaining assets dry through endless legal fees. Mr. Reed said that if we wanted to truly destroy them, we had to let them proceed. We had to let them accept the developer's money. We had to let them commit the federal crime so deeply that no defense attorney could ever save them. But before we could let them walk into their own snare, I had to protect what was left of my life's work. Mr. Reed outlined a swift, aggressive strategy to secure my remaining wealth. I needed to quietly and systematically liquidate any compromised joint accounts. We would establish a new secure offshore trust under my name, and my father's name, shielding the money behind impenetrable legal walls. Diane would have absolutely no access. She would continue to swipe her credit cards and play the wealthy socialite completely unaware that the financial ground beneath her designer shoes had already collapsed. I agreed to the plan without a single ounce of hesitation. I felt no pity for the woman I had married or the son I had raised. They had chosen their path the moment they stepped over my bleeding father to loot his safe. I thanked Mr. Reed and walked out of his drab office into the cool afternoon air. I felt lighter than I had in years. I was no longer an exhausted victim trying to salvage a broken family. I was the architect of their impending ruin. All I had to do now was go home, smile at my treacherous wife, and wait for them to eagerly pull the lever on their own financial guillotine. I sat in the heavy leather chair in the office of my attorney, letting the deep silence stretch between us. The idea was terrifying, but it was undeniably brilliant. We were not going to throw a lifeline to a drowning man. We were going to hand him an anchor. I thought about Brian, my own flesh and blood, walking straight into a federal prison sentence. A normal father would feel an overwhelming instinct to protect his child from the fire. But Brian was no longer a child playing with matches. He was a grown man deliberately burning down my father's legacy to keep himself warm. He had chosen greed over his own grandfather. I looked at the lawyer and nodded my head slowly. We would let them finalize the deal. We would let them commit wire fraud. The lawyer explained the precise timeline of our counter-move. Brian and the commercial developer were moving incredibly fast. Greed always makes people sloppy. Brian desperately needed the cash advance to satisfy his angry corporate creditors. The developer wanted the historic land cheap and fast, before anyone could contest the sudden sale. They were bypassing standard due diligence, entirely relying on the forged power of attorney Diane had created. The lawyer told me that once the developer wired the advance money across state lines, the crime would be cemented in federal jurisdiction. There would be no family court mediation. There would be no tearful apologies to a local judge where they could beg for leniency. The Federal Bureau of Investigation would take over the case. It was a flawless trap, and all I had to do was stand back and let them step into it. I left the drab brick office building with a completely clear mission. Diane truly believed she had siphoned away all my usable wealth over the past 5 years, but she severely underestimated my contingency plans. As a structural engineer, I always built redundancies into my designs to prevent total collapse. For decades, I had maintained several high-yield joint accounts that she rarely checked because the dividends automatically rolled over every quarter. Over the next 3 days, I embarked on a quiet, systematic mission to liquidate every single asset I had left. I did not use online banking because digital transfers often trigger immediate email alerts or text messages to joint account holders. Instead, I drove across the city to visit 5 different physical bank branches. I walked into those brick-and-mortar buildings wearing my old scuffed work boots and a faded flannel shirt. I played the part of a simple retiree making routine financial adjustments. I sat across from young branch managers and quietly closed accounts withdrawing hundreds of thousands of dollars. I watched as the tellers stamped the official cashier checks and initiated the manual wire transfers. Every single dollar was funneled directly into the new secure offshore trust my lawyer had established earlier that morning. This new trust was registered strictly under my name and my father George. It was an absolute financial fortress. The money was held in a jurisdiction that did not recognize domestic civil judgments. This meant that even if Diane tried to sue me during a messy divorce, she would not be able to touch a single penny of it. Her high-priced divorce attorneys would hit a solid brick wall. The wealth I had broken my back to build working 60-hour weeks in the freezing rain and blistering heat was finally safe. I felt a profound physical relief wash over my body as the final transfer receipt was printed and handed to me. The heavy burden of financial vulnerability evaporated. Returning home each evening was an exercise in extreme psychological endurance. I had to look at the woman who betrayed me and pretend everything was perfectly normal. Diane was in incredibly high spirits all week. She genuinely believed their wicked plan was working flawlessly. She spent her afternoons at her exclusive country club playing tennis and sipping expensive wine with her socialite friends. She came home carrying glossy shopping bags from high-end boutiques. She swiped her credit cards with absolute impunity, completely oblivious to the fact that the primary accounts linked to those cards were now running on fumes. I had left just enough money in the daily checking account to avoid immediate declined transactions, giving her the intoxicating illusion of infinite wealth. She bought designer shoes and expensive silk scarves while I sat on the sofa reading the evening paper, pretending to be a tired old man. Meanwhile, my father was recovering remarkably well at the hospital. I visited him every single morning, bringing him fresh coffee and reading the sports section aloud to him. His mind remained razor-sharp, and his spirit was completely unbroken, despite the bruise fading on his temple. I sat by his bedside and told him stories about my childhood, keeping his mood positive. I did not burden him with the dark details of the impending legal strike. He had fought his wars a long time ago on the beaches of Europe. This battle was mine to fight. I held his frail, paper-thin hand and silently promised him that the 50-acre farmhouse he loved so dearly would never be touched by a bulldozer. The tension in my house grew thicker as the week progressed. Brian was calling Diane constantly. I could hear her taking his calls in the laundry room or stepping out onto the back patio, her voice hushed and urgent. They were coordinating the final steps of their fraudulent real estate sale. I stood in the hallway, listening to her soothing him, telling him the advance money would be in his corporate account by the end of the week. She told him I was completely clueless about everything. She told our son that I was just an exhausted old fool slipping into early cognitive decline. Hearing her talk about my mental state with such callous, blatant disregard only fueled the cold fire burning inside my chest. She was digging her own grave and complaining that the shovel was too heavy. The counter-move was now fully complete. The money was secured in the offshore trust. The federal trap was set and waiting. All I had to do was maintain my oblivious act for a few more days. I walked into the kitchen and poured myself a tall glass of ice water. Diane was standing by the marble island, arranging a bouquet of expensive white lilies in a heavy crystal vase. She turned to me and smiled a sweet, poisonous smile that she had perfected over 4 decades of marriage. I smiled back, taking a slow, deliberate sip of my water. She honestly thought she was the brilliant architect of our family destiny. She had absolutely no idea she was simply a temporary tenant in a building I was about to demolish. The performance required a level of physical and mental discipline I had not exercised since my days on the construction sites. I needed to convince my wife and my son that the stress of my father lying in a hospital bed was slowly breaking my mind. I began to construct a carefully curated facade of a man crumbling under the weight of his own age. I slowed my steps. I let my shoulders sag. I intentionally dulled the sharpness in my eyes, replacing my usual observant gaze with a hollow, vacant stare. I started making small, calculated mistakes around the house. I left my leather wallet inside the refrigerator next to the milk. I would walk into the kitchen, look around in total confusion, and ask Diane what I had come in for. I asked her the same questions about her day 2 or 3 times within the same hour. Diane swallowed the bait without a single moment of hesitation. She thrived on my manufactured weakness. Every time I stumbled over my words or forgot a minor detail, her posture grew a little straighter. She would place a manicured hand on my shoulder and speak to me in a slow, patronizing tone normally reserved for a small child. She would tell me to go sit in my recliner and rest my tired mind. I watched the profound smugness radiate from her face. She honestly believed that the man who had engineered skyscrapers was losing his grip on reality. It gave her an intoxicating sense of absolute control. She felt invincible, believing she was outsmarting a fading old fool. Brian dropped by the house a few days later, ostensibly to check on his mother, but actually to coordinate the final details of their fraudulent land deal. I greeted him at the door wearing a wrinkled cardigan and mismatched socks. I offered him a weak, trembling handshake. I asked him how the construction firm was doing, but I deliberately confused the names of his current projects with projects I had completed 20 years ago. Brian chuckled a harsh, arrogant sound and patted my back. He told me not to worry my tired head about the business. He said everything was thriving, and that he was on the verge of closing the biggest deal of his career. I looked at my son, the boy who was actively trying to render his own grandfather homeless, and offered him a vacant, trembling smile. I told him I was so incredibly proud of the man he had become. The lie tasted like battery acid in my mouth, but I swallowed it down perfectly. The true depths of their depravity, however, were revealed the following afternoon when Rachel came to visit. My daughter-in-law arrived carrying a baked casserole, wearing a sympathetic frown that looked completely unnatural on her heavily smoothed face. She breezed into the house, setting the glass dish on the kitchen counter, and immediately began cooing over me. She held my hands and told me how her heart just broke seeing me carry such a heavy burden. She said my father had lived a long, good life, but that I needed to start prioritizing my own health. She suggested that perhaps moving my father to a state-run care facility would finally ease my crushing stress. Her voice dripped with a sickeningly sweet, fake compassion. She was playing the role of the caring daughter-in-law, while simultaneously advocating for the institutionalization of a war veteran just so she could upgrade her lifestyle. I thanked Rachel for her kindness, keeping my voice fragile and weak. I told her I was just so very exhausted and needed to lie down for a short nap. I shuffled slowly into the adjoining living room and lowered myself into my heavy leather recliner. I closed my eyes and let my breathing slow into a deep, rhythmic pattern mimicking a deep sleep. But I was not asleep. I kept my eyes open just a fraction, peering through my eyelashes. Through the narrow slit of my vision, I watched Rachel drop her facade the second she thought I was unconscious. She walked quietly out of the kitchen and stepped into the grand foyer. She pulled a small digital laser measuring tape out of her designer handbag. I watched in absolute frozen silence as she began pointing the laser at the baseboards and the crown molding. She was taking the exact dimensions of the entryway. She moved into the formal dining room, whispering to herself and jotting down notes on her phone. She was calculating the square footage for new hardwood floors. She was planning the extensive renovations she intended to make to my home. The sheer audacity of her actions took my breath away. They were not just planning to steal my father's 50-acre farm. They had already mentally buried me as well. Rachel was walking through my house, measuring my floors, and deciding which walls to knock down once they managed to push me into a nursing home right alongside my father. She was redecorating my home with the phantom money they thought they were about to receive from the fraudulent land developer. I kept my breathing perfectly even, my body completely motionless in the recliner. The rage burning inside my chest was absolute and all-consuming. I was a ghost watching vultures pick at the bones of my life, but the vultures did not know the corpse was breathing. They did not know the trap was already set. I let Rachel finish her measurements. I let her dream about imported Italian marble and custom lighting fixtures. I let them all bathe in the warm glow of their impending victory. Because the higher they allowed their arrogant dreams to soar, the more devastating the impact would be when I finally pulled the ground completely out from under them. The private investigator called me on a burner phone I had purchased specifically for this phase of the operation. He gave me the exact details of the meeting taking place in a high-rise glass building downtown. Brian was sitting in a polished boardroom across from the commercial real estate developer. This developer was a man known for bulldozing historic properties and throwing up cheap residential subdivisions. He was a vulture in the custom suit who thrived on buying distressed assets for pennies on the dollar. He did not care about the history of the 50-acre farm. He only cared about the profit margins. According to the investigator, the meeting was moving at a frantic pace. Brian was sweating, desperate to finalize the paperwork before his own corporate creditors seized his construction firm. The developer knew Brian was bleeding out financially and used that desperation to force a highly irregular preliminary agreement. He demanded the immediate transfer of the property rights, bypassing standard due diligence and extensive title searches. Greed was blinding them both. The developer thought he was stealing a prime piece of real estate from a foolish local business owner. Brian thought he was saving his luxurious lifestyle. My son reached into his expensive leather briefcase and pulled out the durable power of attorney. This was the document my wife Diane had spent hours painstakingly forging. It bore the fake signature of my 100-year-old father, granting Brian absolute godlike authority over the entire estate. Brian slid the fraudulent paper across the polished mahogany table. The developer barely glanced at the signature. He did not bring in an independent notary to verify my father's consent. He simply saw a piece of paper that gave him exactly what he wanted. He handed Brian a thick stack of preliminary transfer contracts. Brian did not read the fine print. He did not consult a legitimate real estate attorney. He just grabbed a pen and began signing his name over and over again on the dotted lines. With every stroke of the pen, my son was digging his own grave. He was officially presenting himself as the legal agent of a property he had absolutely no right to sell. He was legally binding himself to a transaction built entirely on a foundation of forgery and deceit. When the final signature was complete, the developer signaled to his financial officer. They initiated a massive electronic wire transfer. $500,000 was sent directly into the corporate account of Brian's failing shadow company. This was a non-refundable advance, a cash injection designed to lock Brian into the sale and prevent him from backing out. The developer smiled and shook my son's hand. Brian walked out of that glass building feeling like a brilliant corporate titan. He actually believed he had outsmarted me. He believed he had outsmarted my father. But Brian had no idea what he had just done. He was entirely oblivious to the invisible legal fortress Mr. Reed and I had constructed around that land. The 50-acre farm was protected by a decades-old, irrevocable trust. I was the sole trustee. My father did not legally own the land, so a forged power of attorney in his name was completely legally worthless. Brian had just sold thin air to a ruthless commercial developer. The developer had just paid $500,000 for a piece of paper that held no legal weight whatsoever. More importantly, the moment that $500,000 crossed state lines and landed in Brian's bank account, the nature of the crime fundamentally changed. This was no longer a simple domestic dispute over an elderly man's estate. This was no longer a local matter for a small-town judge to mediate. By accepting $500,000 through an electronic banking system based on a forged document, Brian had committed massive federal wire fraud. He had stolen money from a powerful corporate entity using the banking infrastructure of the federal government. The trap Mr. Reed had designed was now fully armed and locked. I sat in my home office visualizing the sheer magnitude of my son's stupidity. The investigator sent me real-time updates on how Brian was spending the stolen advance. He did not save a single dollar. He did not put the money aside for my father's supposed medical care. He immediately routed the funds to his most aggressive corporate creditors. He paid off the heavy machinery loans he had defaulted on. He paid off the private lenders who were threatening to seize his luxury vehicles. He was using the phantom money to plug the holes in his sinking ship, completely unaware that he had just blown the entire bottom out of the hull. Brian drove back to his sprawling suburban mansion and poured himself a glass of expensive scotch. He called Diane to celebrate. The investigator intercepted the call. Diane praised his business acumen and told him how proud she was of his quick thinking. They laughed about how easy it was to pull the wool over my eyes. They joked about how my father would not even notice his land was gone once they moved him into a cheap care facility. They bathed in the warm, intoxicating glow of their stolen victory. I listened to the report with a cold, steady heart. As a structural engineer, I had spent my entire career calculating the exact moment a building would collapse under its own weight. I knew that every structure had a breaking point. Brian and Diane had just removed the final load-bearing pillar holding up their entire lives. They were standing in a doomed building celebrating the view. I turned off the burner phone and walked out of my office to make myself a quiet cup of coffee. I would let them enjoy their weekend. I would let them spend the stolen money. Because the higher they climbed on their ladder of lies, the more devastating the impact would be when gravity finally took over. The private dining room at the Continental was bathed in the warm amber glow of crystal chandeliers. It was the most exclusive and outrageously expensive restaurant in the city, a place where the appetizers cost more than a weekly grocery run, and the waitstaff moved like silent ghosts in tailored suits. Diane had insisted on booking this exact room to celebrate my father George reaching his 100th birthday. She had spent the last 3 days obsessing over the floral arrangements and the custom menus. From the outside, it looked like the ultimate gesture of love from a devoted family. But as I stood by the mahogany door watching the waitstaff pour imported champagne, I felt a sickening wave of disgust. I knew exactly where the money for this lavish display was coming from. Every single drop of champagne, every bite of caviar, and every exotic flower on that table was being paid for by the $500,000 advance Brian had stolen from the commercial developer. They were throwing a party for my father using the money they had obtained by selling his legacy out from under him. Diane floated through the room wearing a brand new designer dress that sparkled under the chandelier light. She clinked glasses with the guests she had invited. She did not invite my father's old military buddies or the neighbors he had known for 40 years. She invited her wealthy friends from the country club and Brian's flashy business associates. She wanted an audience to witness her playing the role of the perfect matriarch. She laughed loudly, tossing her head back and placing a manicured hand on the shoulders of her guests, telling them how deeply she cherished family. Her performance was flawless. If I had not seen her leave my father bleeding on the hardwood floor, I might have believed she actually possessed a heart. George sat at the head of the long table in his wheelchair. He wore his best navy blue suit, the fabric hanging loosely on his frail frame. The bruise on his temple had faded to a dull yellow, but the exhaustion in his eyes was profound. I stood directly behind his chair, acting as his silent guardian. He knew Diane had ignored his pleas for help that day in the living room. We had shared a quiet understanding earlier that morning. I had asked him to just endure this dinner, to smile, and let them put on their show. He was a soldier. He knew how to hold a position while waiting for reinforcements. He watched the room with sharp, faded blue eyes, taking in the grotesque theater of his own birthday celebration. Brian made his grand entrance a few minutes later, acting like a conquering king. He wore a custom-tailored suit that practically screamed new money, and a heavy gold watch gleamed on his wrist. He was riding the euphoric high of a man who believed he had just outsmarted his massive corporate debt. He swaggered around the room, shaking hands and ordering the most expensive bottles of wine on the reserve list. He handed his premium credit card to the maitre d' with a practiced arrogance completely oblivious to the fact that the funds backing that card were tied directly to massive federal wire fraud. He thought he was a brilliant CEO. He was actually just a thief gorging himself at his own Last Supper. Rachel trailed behind him, holding a professional camera. She hovered over my father, adjusting the lapels of his suit and smoothing his blanket with sickeningly sweet, exaggerated motions. She ordered Brian to stand on one side of the wheelchair, while she and Diane crowded in on the other. They forced wide, beaming smiles for the camera, capturing the illusion of a deeply connected, loving family. They needed these photographs for their social media profiles to maintain their pristine public image. I watched Rachel lean down and kiss my father on the cheek. This was the exact same woman I had watched through a hidden camera as she coldly measured the square footage of my home planning renovations for the moment they finally managed to lock me away in a nursing home. The sheer magnitude of their hypocrisy was suffocating. When the dinner plates were cleared away, Brian stood up and tapped his crystal glass with a silver spoon. The room fell silent. He raised his glass of $200 champagne and looked down at my father. He delivered a sweeping, emotional toast about building on his grandfather's incredible legacy. He spoke about honor and hard work and family values without a single ounce of shame. He looked right at me and thanked me for setting such a strong example of leadership. The words flowed out of his mouth like toxic sludge. He was toasting the very legacy he had secretly sold to a ruthless developer just 48 hours prior. Diane followed his toast with a speech of her own. She dabbed at her dry eyes with a linen napkin and spoke about the heavy emotional toll of watching loved ones age. She told the room how she and Brian were dedicated to making sure George spent his final years in absolute comfort and peace no matter what difficult decisions had to be made. She was publicly laying the groundwork for pushing him into a cheap, state-run facility. She was building the narrative that whatever happened next was done out of pure, heartbreaking necessity. The guests murmured in sympathetic agreement, completely captivated by her tragic performance. I stood quietly behind my father, holding a glass of iced water. I did not flip the table. I did not grab the champagne bottle and smash it against the wall. I simply smiled a warm, vacuous smile and nodded along with their speeches. I let them bathe in the applause of their wealthy friends. I looked at my wife and my son raising their glasses in a triumphant toast, and I focused entirely on the mathematics of the trap. They were celebrating their impending wealth, but they were truly celebrating their own destruction. Every extravagant purchase tonight was another digital footprint, another piece of evidence tying them to the stolen developer funds. They were digging their graves with silver spoons, and I was perfectly content to let them keep digging until there was no way out. The heavy crystal glasses clinked around the table as the guests continued to drink the expensive wine Brian had ordered. I sat quietly next to my father, watching the grotesque display of wealth. I felt the cold, smooth edge of a small digital voice recorder inside my jacket pocket. I had purchased it specifically for this evening, knowing that the combination of free-flowing alcohol and absolute arrogance would loosen their tongues. I just needed the perfect opportunity. Diane was standing a few feet away, laughing loudly at a terrible joke made by a commercial real estate agent. She had left her designer handbag sitting wide open on the empty chair to my left. I reached into my jacket, palmed the small black device, and smoothly dropped it deep into the side pocket of her bag. 10 minutes later, Diane tapped Rachel on the shoulder. They exchanged a knowing look and excused themselves to freshen up in the private powder room attached to our dining suite. Diane grabbed her handbag, and Rachel followed close behind. I sat at the table cutting a piece of soft bread for my father, offering him a gentle smile. My hands were perfectly steady. I knew the high-definition microphone was running, capturing every single vibration, every whispered secret, and every toxic laugh. I spent the next 20 minutes making dull small talk with a business associate of my son, playing the role of the tired, aging father. I watched the powder room door until it finally opened. Diane and Rachel emerged, their makeup flawless, their smiles radiant. They had no idea they were carrying a digital bomb. The extravagant dinner finally came to an end. Brian paid the massive bill with a black credit card funded entirely by the stolen commercial developer advance. We packed my father into his accessible van, and I drove the quiet, dark route back to the suburbs. Diane sat in the passenger seat, humming a cheerful tune, totally intoxicated by her own perceived brilliance. When we walked through our front door, she dropped her heavy designer bag on the kitchen counter and announced she was going upstairs to take a long, hot bath. I waited until I heard the bathroom door lock and the water start running. I walked into the kitchen, reached into her bag, and retrieved the recorder. I walked into my home office, locked the heavy wooden door, and sat at my desk. The house was dead quiet. I plugged the small device into my computer and slipped on my noise-canceling headphones. I clicked the audio file and scrubbed through the muffled background noise of the dining room. I heard the rustle of fabric and the heavy thud of the handbag being set down on a hard surface. Then the audio shifted. The acoustics changed to the sharp, echoing sound of a tiled restroom. I heard the rush of water from a sink faucet, and then I heard my wife speak. Diane let out a loud, exasperated sigh. She told Rachel that she could not stand another minute of pretending to care about the old man. She complained bitterly that George smelled like stale medicine and dust, and that pushing his wheelchair around was ruining her evening. Rachel laughed, a sharp, mocking sound that pierced my ears. My daughter-in-law chimed in, saying that the old man was a dead weight holding them all back. Rachel asked Diane how much longer they had to play this exhausting game. She wanted to know exactly when they could finally move George out of the house so they could start bringing in the contractors for their massive renovations. The response Diane gave chilled me to the very marrow of my bones. My wife lowered her voice to a conspiratorial whisper, but the microphone caught every single word. She told Rachel that the final closing on the property was scheduled for Friday morning. She said that once the developer wired the rest of the clean money, they were moving George out on Monday. Rachel asked where they were going to put him. Diane casually named a notoriously underfunded state-run facility on the farthest edge of the county. It was a bleak concrete building famous in our city for gross neglect and horrific living conditions. Diane said it was incredibly cheap, completely out of sight, and that she had already forged the intake paperwork. Rachel asked if I would fight them on the decision to put my father in such a miserable place. Diane let out a cruel barking laugh. She told Rachel that her husband was nothing but a spineless, oblivious workhorse who had never questioned her authority in 40 years of marriage. She said I was losing my mind anyway, breaking down under the stress. She bragged that she could hand me a glossy fake medical brochure, and I would blindly believe whatever lies she spun. She said I was too weak and too stupid to stop them. They both laughed again, the sound bouncing off the restroom walls. It was a sound devoid of any human empathy. I took the headphones off and laid them gently on my desk. The room spun slightly. Hearing the sheer malice in her voice was staggering. They were not just greedy socialites desperate for cash. They were profoundly cruel. They fully intended to lock a 100-year-old war veteran in a miserable facility of neglect, simply because they did not want to look at him anymore. They viewed me as a pathetic tool, a broken machine they could easily manipulate. I stared at the blank wall of my office, my jaw set so hard my teeth ached. My resolve, which had already been solid iron, hardened into something totally unbreakable. This was no longer just about protecting my wealth or saving a piece of land. It was about the absolute total annihilation of their comfortable lives. I was going to strip away everything they loved, and I was going to make sure they felt every single second of the fall. The final week leading up to the closing date was a masterclass in psychological warfare. The commercial developer, impatient to break ground on his new suburban subdivision, pushed Brian hard. He demanded the final transfer documents be signed by Friday morning. My son, intoxicated by the massive $500,000 advance he had already burned through, readily agreed. He called his mother to confirm the timeline. I stood in the kitchen wiping down the marble counter as Diane took the call. She paced the length of the living room, her voice dropping to an excited, conspiratorial whisper. She told Brian that everything was perfectly on track. She assured him that the old man, meaning me, was practically catatonic with stress, and that George would be transferred to the state-run facility on Monday, just 3 days after the deal closed. I listened to her plan the destruction of my father's life while smiling and humming a cheerful tune. When she ended the call, she walked back into the kitchen, pouring herself a fresh cup of coffee. She placed a hand on my arm and told me she had arranged for a lovely home care nurse to visit George next week to help ease my burdens. I looked her directly in the eyes and thanked her profusely. I told her I did not know how I would survive this ordeal without her unwavering support. The absolute smugness radiating from her face was almost blinding. She genuinely believed she had orchestrated the perfect crime. But while Diane was picking out paint colors for her imaginary home renovations, Mr. Reed and I were moving with lethal precision. The trap was no longer a theory. It was a fully loaded weapon, and we were handing the trigger to the federal government. On Wednesday afternoon, I told Diane I was going to the pharmacy to pick up more of George's medication. Instead, I drove directly to a nondescript government building downtown. Mr. Reed was waiting for me in the lobby, his worn leather briefcase bulging with the evidence we had meticulously gathered over the past month. We were escorted into a secure conference room by 2 serious-looking detectives from the State Financial Fraud Division and a lead investigator from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The atmosphere in the room was heavy, clinical, and entirely devoid of emotion. These men did not care about broken families or broken hearts. They cared about the cold, hard facts of a massive financial crime. Mr. Reed opened his briefcase and began laying out the architecture of my son's destruction. He started with the forged, durable power of attorney, outlining exactly how Diane had falsified my father's signature. He provided the certified documentation proving the existence of the irrevocable trust, explicitly demonstrating that my father had absolutely no legal authority to sell the 50-acre estate. The FBI investigator took notes, his expression grim and focused. Next, I slid a heavily encrypted flash drive across the table. I explained that it contained the high-definition security footage of Diane Bryan and Rachel prying open my father's vintage floor safe while he lay bleeding in the hospital. I provided the detailed digital logs proving the unauthorized transfer of $500,000 across state lines from the commercial developer directly into the accounts of Bryan's shadow companies. Finally, I played the audio recording I had captured at the restaurant. The room fell into absolute dead silence as my wife and daughter-in-law coldly plotted to lock a 100-year-old war veteran in a decrepit state facility simply because they did not want to look at him anymore. The lead detective paused the recording. He looked at me, his eyes betraying a flicker of genuine shock beneath his professional facade. He asked me a single question. He asked if I was absolutely certain I wanted to proceed, because once the federal machine was set in motion, there would be no stopping it. My wife would face years in a federal penitentiary. My son would lose his business, his freedom, and his reputation. I looked at the detective without a single ounce of hesitation. I told him that the people on those recordings were not my family. They were criminals who had broken into my life and tried to steal everything I had built. I told him to authorize the warrants. Mr. Reed and the federal agents spent the next 3 hours finalizing the tactical logistics. We mapped out the exact layout of the commercial developer's corporate boardroom where the closing was scheduled to take place on Friday morning. The FBI confirmed they would have a tactical financial crimes unit positioned in the lobby of the building, ready to move the moment Bryan attempted to finalize the fraudulent sale. Mr. Reed assured them that I would be in the room to personally detonate the final confrontation. We were not going to arrest them quietly in the middle of the night. We were going to let them sit in the highest tower of their arrogance, and we were going to tear the entire building down around them. I drove back to my quiet suburban home, the evening sun casting long shadows across the driveway. Diane was in the kitchen preparing a lavish dinner, humming that same cheerful tune. She poured me a glass of expensive red wine and asked how my errands went. I took a slow sip, letting the rich flavor coat my tongue. I smiled at my treacherous wife, the woman who had shared my bed for 40 years, and told her that all the necessary preparations had been made. I told her that by the end of the week, all of our problems would finally be resolved. She beamed, raising her glass to toast our future. She had absolutely no idea that she was toasting her own impending doom. Would you like to know more about the legal process of establishing an irrevocable trust, or how financial fraud investigations track wire transfers across state lines? Thursday night descended on our suburban home with a heavy, suffocating stillness, the kind of quiet that precedes a devastating hurricane. I sat in my heavy leather armchair in the living room, listening to the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Every tick was a countdown. Tomorrow morning the trap would spring shut, but tonight we had to play out the final act of this 40-year tragedy. The house smelled faintly of roasted garlic and expensive herbs. Diane was in the kitchen preparing a lavish dinner. She was humming again, that light, airy melody that made my stomach churn. She was a woman standing on the edge of a cliff, convinced she was about to take flight. I watched her walk into the living room. She had changed into a soft cashmere sweater and her favorite pearl earrings. In her hands, she carried 2 large crystal goblets and a bottle of deep red wine. It was a rare vintage one we usually reserved for major anniversaries or significant milestones. How fitting, I thought, that she chose this exact bottle to celebrate the eve of her ultimate betrayal. She moved with a relaxed, fluid grace, completely unburdened by guilt or conscience. She set the glasses on the heavy wooden coffee table, the very same table my father had struck his head against just weeks prior. She did not even look at the floor where he had bled. She only looked at me, her eyes shining with a manufactured warmth. She poured the dark ruby liquid into the glasses. The sound of the wine splashing against the crystal filled the quiet room. She handed me a glass, her fingers brushing lightly against mine. I took it, making sure my hand trembled just a fraction to maintain the illusion of my fragile state. She sat on the sofa across from me, tucking her legs beneath her like a contented cat. She took a slow, appreciative sip of her wine and let out a long, dramatic sigh of relief. "Bruce," she said, her voice soft and melodic, "I feel like we can finally breathe again." I looked at her, maintaining a blank, pleasant expression, and asked her what she meant. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees. "I am just so relieved about Brian," she explained, her eyes wide and innocent. "He called me this afternoon. He said his construction business is finally turning a corner. He secured a massive new contract, and the financial pressure is completely lifting off his shoulders." She smiled, a brilliant, dazzling smile that hid a soul full of rot. "It has been so hard watching him struggle," she continued, laying her hand over her heart. "But he worked so hard to turn things around. He is so much like you, Bruce. He has your drive and your business sense. I am just so incredibly proud of him." The absolute audacity of her words was almost magnificent. She was sitting in my house, drinking my wine, and comparing a cowardly thief to me. Brian had not worked hard. Brian had driven my legacy into the dirt and then forged my dying father's signature to steal a 50-acre farm. But Diane was fully committed to the delusion. She needed to believe her own lies to justify the monstrous things she had done. She needed me to validate her twisted narrative. She needed the old oblivious workhorse to nod and agree so she could sleep soundly before destroying my family the next morning. And with George, she added, her tone shifting to one of feigned, mournful sympathy. "I know it has been so difficult for you lately, darling. The stress has been eating you alive. But next week, when we get him settled into that new care facility, you are going to feel so much better. We can finally relax. We can take that cruise to the coast we have been talking about. We can just enjoy our golden years in peace." She raised her crystal glass toward me, an invitation to toast our beautiful impending future. I looked at the dark red wine in my glass. I thought about my father sitting in his hospital room, trusting me to protect the land he had bled for. I thought about the federal agents currently staging their positions in a downtown corporate lobby. I thought about the 40 years of marriage, the vacations, the birthdays, the life we had built that was entirely constructed on a hollow foundation of deceit. I slowly raised my glass to meet hers. The crystal chimed with a high, clear note that rang through the silent living room. I looked my wife directly in the eyes. I let the facade of the tired, confused old man slip away just for a microscopic second. I held her gaze with absolute cold clarity. "Yes, Diane," I said, my voice perfectly steady and deep. "Tomorrow changes everything." She smiled brightly, completely missing the deadly weight behind my words. She took a generous swallow of her wine, bathing in her imaginary victory. I took a sip of mine. The wine tasted bitter and dry. We sat there in the quiet living room, finishing our drinks. She talked about the weather and her country club friends and the new patio furniture she wanted to order. I nodded and hummed in agreement, mechanically playing my part for the final few hours. I watched her lips move, but I stopped listening to the words. I was already mentally walking through the doors of the commercial developer's boardroom. I was already seeing the look on her face when the federal handcuffs clicked around her wrists. When the evening finally wound down, Diane kissed my cheek and floated up the carpeted stairs to our bedroom. I stayed downstairs for a long time, sitting in the dark. I walked into my home office and looked at the framed blueprints on the walls one last time. Tomorrow, the life I knew would be permanently erased. There would be public humiliation, legal battles, and the agonizing reality of watching my own son go to prison. It was going to be ugly and painful and utterly devastating. But as I turned off the lamp and stood in the shadows of the home I had built, I felt no fear. I felt the profound, steady calm of a man who was finally stepping out of a lie and into the harsh, cleansing light of the truth. The storm was coming, but I was the one bringing the thunder. Friday morning arrived with a crisp, clear blue sky. I parked my truck 3 blocks away from the towering glass and steel monolith that housed the commercial real estate developer. Inside, on the 42nd floor, my wife Diane, my son Brian, and my daughter-in-law Rachel were currently sitting in a plush mahogany boardroom. I could perfectly picture the scene. The developer, a man who made his fortune paving over history, was likely offering them sparkling water and gourmet coffee. Brian was probably adjusting his expensive silk tie, sweating slightly under the collar, but high on the thrill of his stolen victory. Diane and Rachel would be sitting side by side, crossing their legs and exchanging those smug, secret smiles they reserved for moments of absolute triumph. They were gathered around a massive, polished table, staring at the thick stack of final transfer deeds. All Brian had to do was press a heavy ink pen to the dotted line, and the 50-acre farm would be completely erased. They thought they had reached the finish line. They had absolutely no idea they were sitting at ground zero. I did not wear my faded flannel shirt or my scuffed work boots today. I had gone to the back of my closet and pulled out a tailored charcoal gray suit I had not worn in a decade. I tied a crisp crimson tie and polished my leather shoes until they shined like dark mirrors. When I looked at my reflection that morning, the tired, oblivious old man was completely gone. The structural engineer, the man who commanded massive construction crews and calculated exact breaking points, stared back at me. I walked through the revolving glass doors of the corporate lobby, my strides long and purposeful. The air conditioning was freezing, but I did not feel the cold. I rode the silent, mirrored elevator up to the 42nd floor, watching the digital numbers climb higher and higher. The receptionist at the front desk tried to ask for my name, but I walked right past her, ignoring her protests. I approached the heavy double doors of the executive conference room. I did not knock. I placed my hands on the solid brass handles and pushed the doors wide open. The heavy doors swung inward with a solid thud that echoed across the massive room. 4 heads snapped up in unison. Brian was hovering over the table, a gold pen gripped tightly in his right hand, hovering just an inch above the signature line. Diane sat next to him, holding a crystal glass of sparkling water halfway to her mouth. The color drained from her face so rapidly, it looked as though she had seen a ghost. Rachel gasped, letting out a sharp, panicked sound as she dropped her designer handbag onto the plush carpet. The developer frowned, irritated by the sudden, unauthorized interruption to his multi-million-dollar transaction. But the shock paralyzing my family was not just because I had walked into the room. It was because of the man I was pushing in front of me. I wheeled my father, George, right into the center of their pristine corporate sanctuary. George did not look like a confused, fragile old man who needed to be locked away in a decrepit state facility. He was sitting perfectly upright in his wheelchair. I had helped him dress in his best dark navy suit. Pinned to his left lapel was his silver World War II service medal, gleaming proudly under the modern recessed lighting. His white hair was neatly combed, and his hands rested firmly on the armrests of his chair, without a single tremor. But it was his eyes that truly commanded the room. Those faded blue eyes were razor-sharp, burning with a quiet, righteous fury. He looked directly at Brian, the grandson he had bounced on his knee, the boy he had taken fishing, on the very land Brian was currently trying to sell. George did not say a single word, but his piercing gaze carried the heavy, devastating weight of absolute judgment. The history of our family, the sweat, and the sacrifice poured into that soil was radiating from his glare. Brian dropped the gold pen onto the table. It clattered loudly, breaking the stunned silence. He stammered, asking what I was doing there, and insisting that I was supposed to be resting at home. His voice pitched up into a nervous, panicked squeak. Diane quickly recovered her composure, or at least she tried to. She stood up her chair, scraping harshly against the hardwood floor. She forced that same sickeningly sweet tone she had used on me for weeks, telling me I was confused again. She walked toward me, holding her hands out, like she was approaching a frightened animal. She said this was a private business meeting for Brian, and offered to take George and me back down to the car so we could go get some lunch and rest my mind. I did not mirror her sweet tone. I did not slouch my shoulders or act like the broken man she so desperately wanted me to be. I stood tall, crossing my arms over my chest, forming a physical barricade between her and my father. I told her I was not confused, and my voice boomed across the polished boardroom, carrying an authority that made her physically step back. I said I knew exactly where I was. I knew exactly who was in this room, and I knew exactly what kind of fraudulent paperwork my son was about to sign. The developer stood up, buttoning his expensive suit jacket, looking between Brian and me with growing impatience. He demanded to know who I was and what this interruption was about. He told me that if this was a family dispute, I needed to take it outside because they were in the middle of closing a highly time-sensitive real estate transaction. I looked the developer dead in the eye, completely unfazed by his corporate intimidation. I stepped forward, planting my hands firmly on the edge of the mahogany table. I told him that there was no transaction taking place today. I told him that the man sitting across from him was not a brilliant business owner, but a desperate liar drowning in corporate debt. Brian turned a sickly shade of gray. He tried to speak, to interrupt me, to spin another web of lies, but the words died in his throat. Diane gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles turning white, her pristine facade finally beginning to crack under the crushing pressure of reality. Rachel shrunk back into her plush leather chair, looking desperately toward the exit. They thought they had locked all the doors and secured their stolen future. They had absolutely no idea the storm had already arrived inside the room. Brian pushed his heavy leather chair back so forcefully it scraped a loud, jarring noise across the polished hardwood floor. He stood up and tried to puff out his chest, attempting to summon the commanding authority of a wealthy chief executive, but his voice completely betrayed him. He stammered, asking what on earth I was doing interrupting a private corporate meeting. He looked nervously at the developer and forced a hollow, panicked laugh. He pointed a trembling finger at me and claimed I was just a confused, tired old man who had wandered away from home. He commanded me to take my father and leave the room immediately before I embarrassed our family any further. I did not blink. I did not take a single step backward. I simply reached inside my tailored suit jacket and pulled out a thick legal folder. I walked right past my son, completely ignoring his frantic, sweaty presence. I stepped up to the edge of the massive mahogany table and dropped the folder right on top of his final transfer deeds. It landed with a heavy, definitive thud that seemed to suck all the remaining oxygen out of the room. I looked directly at the developer. The man was practically vibrating with irritation, tapping his expensive gold pen against his legal notepad. I told him he was going to want to put his pen down and read the first page of my folder very carefully. The developer scoffed and rolled his eyes, but his gaze naturally fell to the paper I had placed in front of him. His arrogant, impatient expression froze instantly. I kept my voice incredibly calm, measured, and dangerously polite. I told him he was currently attempting to purchase a historic 50-acre property based on a durable power of attorney signed by my father. I watched the developer slowly look up from the document, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. I explained that there was a massive, catastrophic flaw in his legal due diligence. I told him that my father George had not legally owned that farmhouse or the surrounding land for over 20 years. Diane let out a sharp, choked gasp. Brian stared at me, his mouth opening and closing silently, like a suffocating fish. I explained that decades ago, my father and I placed the entire 50-acre estate into an airtight, irrevocable trust. I informed the room that the trust was the sole legal owner of the property and that I was the sole named trustee. I leaned closer to the developer, making sure he heard every single syllable clearly. I told him that absolutely no one could sell, mortgage, or transfer that land without my explicit notarized signature. Therefore, a power of attorney granting control over my father held absolutely zero legal weight over that specific property. The developer's face turned a mottled shade of red. He looked over at Brian, then back at me. He pointed a finger at the power of attorney sitting on the table, protesting that he had a notarized document proving Brian was the legal agent. I did not raise my voice. I simply told him he was holding a masterful piece of fiction. I explained that my wife Diane had spent hours practicing my father's signature to forge that document, hoping to steal a dying man's legacy to bail out our son's bankrupt construction firm. I told the developer that Brian had just sold him a piece of paper that was legally worthless. The silence in the room became incredibly heavy, thick with the smell of impending ruin. The developer grabbed the documents from my folder, flipping through the certified trust papers, his eyes scanning the official state seals and the dates. The reality of the situation hit him like a physical blow. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him pale and shaken. He dropped the papers onto the table and turned his terrifying, furious gaze toward my son. The developer realized the catastrophic mistake he had made by skipping standard title searches to rush a cheap land deal. He realized that the massive $500,000 non-refundable advance he had wired 3 days ago was gone. He had wired $500,000 across state lines to a man who sold him thin air. Brian physically shrank under the developer's intense glare. He held his hands up, stammering out a pathetic string of denials, claiming there must be some sort of legal loophole or some simple misunderstanding. The developer slammed his fists onto the mahogany table, shaking the crystal water glasses. He leaned over the table, his voice a low, threatening growl. He demanded to know exactly where his money was. He told Brian he had exactly 10 seconds to reverse the wire transfer before he tore Brian's entire life apart. But I knew Brian could not reverse the wire. I knew the money was already gone, swallowed up by his aggressive corporate creditors and the private lenders he had desperately tried to pay off over the weekend. Brian looked at Diane with wide, terrified eyes, silently begging his mother to fix the situation. Diane sat frozen in her chair, staring at the legal documents on the table, her pristine socialite facade completely shattered into a million irreparable pieces. Rachel pressed her hands over her mouth, realizing her lavish lifestyle had just evaporated. The trap had sprung exactly as Mr. Reed and I had designed. The developer realized he was not the clever predator in this scenario. He was just another victim of my family's boundless, blinding greed. And my son realized he was no longer a wealthy chief executive above the law. He was a fraud cornered in a glass room with absolutely nowhere left to hide, while my father watched his ultimate downfall from his wheelchair. Diane scrambled to assemble the shattered pieces of her pristine socialite mask. She stood up her chair, scraping loudly against the floor, and forced a trembling, overly sweet smile. She looked at the furious commercial developer and let out a breathless, theatrical sigh. "Please excuse my husband," she said, her voice dripping with a fake, syrupy pity. "He has been under so much stress lately. His mind is just failing him. He gets these terrible spells of confusion and mixes up his stories." She walked toward me, reaching out a manicured hand as if to gently guide a lost child out of the room. "Come on, Bruce," she murmured. "Let us take your father home so you can rest your tired head. You do not know what you are saying." I did not step back. I did not swat her hand away. I simply looked down at her outstretched fingers and then back up into her panicked, calculating eyes. I told her that I was not tired. I told her that for the first time in 40 years, I was completely and utterly awake. I reached into my tailored suit jacket and pulled out my tablet. I walked over to the massive mahogany table and placed the screen flat on the polished wood, facing the developer and my completely paralyzed son. I told them that if my words were just the ramblings of a confused old man, they should perhaps consult a more objective witness. I tapped the screen and opened the video file. I turned the volume all the way up so the sound would carry into every single corner of that massive corporate suite. The high-definition security footage began to play. The crisp color video showed the exact interior of my father's living room. The timestamp in the corner flashed bright white, proving the exact date and time. It was the exact same hour my father was lying in a hospital emergency room with a bruised skull. The audio crackled to life, filling the boardroom with the undeniable sound of my family's treachery. The developer leaned forward, his furious eyes locked onto the screen. He watched as Brian hoisted a heavy metal crowbar. He heard the harsh grinding noise of iron scraping against iron as my son pried open the vintage floor safe. The video played the sickeningly triumphant laughter of my daughter-in-law Rachel as Diane reached into the dark vault and pulled out the thick manila envelope containing the stolen deed. I watched the developer's face contort with absolute disgust as the digital version of Diane told Brian to hurry up before the old fool came back from the hospital. The temperature in the corporate boardroom dropped to absolute zero. The air grew so thin, it was practically unbreathable. There was no more room for lies. There was no more space for Diane to play the tragic burdened wife. The digital proof of their monstrous greed was playing on a continuous loop, exposing them as common thieves picking the bones of a dying man. Brian sank back into his heavy leather chair, his face burying into his trembling hands. A low, pathetic whine escaped his throat as he realized the sheer magnitude of his destruction. He had not just lied to his father. He had defrauded a multi-million-dollar commercial developer and left a digital trail of evidence so clear a first-year law student could convict him. Diane stood frozen in the middle of the room, her mouth opening and closing wordlessly. The sweet, patronizing mask had completely melted away, leaving only the terrified face of a woman who knew her luxurious life of country clubs and designer clothes was permanently over. Rachel began to quietly sob in the corner, shaking her head and whispering that she had nothing to do with it, desperately trying to abandon her sinking ship. I looked at my father sitting quietly in his wheelchair. He did not say a word, but he gave me a slow, firm nod of approval. The land he had bled for the house he had built for our family was finally completely secure. The vultures had been grounded. Before the developer could unleash the full force of his corporate fury, the heavy wooden doors of the boardroom swung open for a second time. Mr. Reed, my ruthless bulldog of an attorney, strode into the room. He wore a sharp gray suit and carried his worn leather briefcase, looking like a predator who had finally cornered his prey. He did not walk in alone. Flanking him on either side were two broad-shouldered men wearing dark windbreakers with gold badges clipped to their belts. They were senior detectives from the State Financial Crimes Unit, and they did not look like they were there to negotiate. Mr. Reed smiled, his teeth gleaming under the recessed lighting. He looked at Brian and Diane with an expression of pure, unfiltered satisfaction. He introduced the detectives to the room and announced that they were interrupting this real estate transaction to execute multiple federal arrest warrants. He explained that accepting $500,000 across state lines using a forged, durable power of attorney was a massive federal offense. He listed the charges, dropping them into the silent room like heavy stones. Wire fraud, grand larceny, elder financial abuse, conspiracy to commit fraud. The developer immediately backed away from the table, raising his hands to signal his complete cooperation with the authorities. He glared at Brian and promised my son that his corporate lawyers would be filing a civil suit to recover every single penny of the stolen advance by the end of the day. The detectives stepped forward, the metallic clink of handcuffs echoing loudly against the mahogany walls. The grand illusion of my family's wealth and prestige evaporated into nothingness. They were completely surrounded, trapped in a glass tower of their own making, waiting for the cold, hard reality of justice to finally pull them under. The heavy metallic click of the handcuffs snapping shut echoed through the pristine corporate boardroom. It was a sound that shattered the illusion of my son's entire life. The lead detective grabbed Brian by his expensive suit jacket, spinning him around and pressing his hands behind his back. Brian did not fight back. He went completely limp, sobbing like a broken child. The detective read him his rights, his voice a flat mechanical drone listing the charges that would bury my son for decades. Wire fraud, grand larceny, forgery of a legal document, elder financial abuse. With every word, Brian sank lower toward the polished hardwood floor, the heavy gold watch on his wrist clinking uselessly against the cold steel brackets binding his wrists. Diane watched her golden child being hauled away, her eyes wide with a manic, uncomprehending terror. When the second detective approached her, she actually tried to smooth down her designer dress and force a polite high society smile. She told the officer there was a terrible misunderstanding, that she was a respected member of the community, and that they needed to call her country club lawyer immediately. The detective did not smile back. He reached out, grabbed her manicured wrists, and locked them tightly in iron. Diane let out a sharp, guttural shriek as the cold metal bit into her skin. The reality of her pristine, wealthy life instantly dissolving into a federal prison sentence, finally broke her mind. She began to thrash, weeping, and begging me to tell them it was all a mistake, begging me to save her. I simply looked at her, my face a mask of stone, and told her that the only mistake I ever made was trusting her. In the corner of the room, Rachel backed away until she hit the glass wall of the boardroom. She held her hands up, tears streaming down her heavily contoured face, frantically shaking her head. She pointed a trembling finger at her husband and her mother-in-law, screaming that she had absolutely nothing to do with the forgery or the money. She cried out that she was just a victim of their lies, a supportive wife who was completely in the dark. She begged the detectives to let her go home, promising to cooperate and testify against them if they just let her walk out the door. She thought she could simply abandon her sinking family and swim to safety. Mr. Reed stepped forward, opening his worn leather briefcase. He looked at Rachel with a cold, unforgiving smile and told her that the federal government already had all the testimony they needed. He instructed the detective to play the final piece of evidence. The officer pulled out a digital recorder and pressed play. The acoustic echo of the restaurant restroom filled the boardroom. Rachel's own voice played loud and clear, laughing cruelly as she plotted with Diane to lock my 100-year-old father in a decrepit, abusive state facility just so she could renovate my home. Rachel's frantic sobbing stopped instantly, her face drained of all color. The detective stepped forward, pulled her arms behind her back, and locked the third pair of handcuffs securely around her wrists. She was charged as a full co-conspirator in the elder abuse and fraud ring. The commercial developer stood near the heavy wooden doors, watching my family being marched out in absolute disgrace. He was pacing furiously, his phone already pressed to his ear as he barked orders at his corporate legal team. He looked directly at Brian, who was shuffling toward the elevator with his head bowed in shame. The developer announced with a booming, wrathful voice that he was filing a massive civil suit before the banks even closed today. He promised to seize every remaining asset, every vehicle, and every personal belonging Brian possessed to recoup his stolen $500,000. He swore he would bleed my son so dry that Brian would not even be able to afford a public defender. The boardroom doors swung shut, leaving behind a deafening, peaceful silence. The screaming, the crying, and the frantic lies faded away as the elevator doors closed on my ruined family. I stood in the center of the room, straightening my tailored suit jacket, feeling a profound sense of closure. I walked over to my father, who was sitting quietly in his wheelchair, watching the entire spectacle with calm, steady eyes. I placed my hand on his shoulder. We had survived the ultimate betrayal, and the predators who tried to consume us were gone forever. The cold concrete of the county jail parking lot was a harsh contrast to the manicured lawns of the country club Diane was accustomed to. She walked out of the heavy metal doors, shivering in the afternoon breeze. Her designer dress, once a symbol of her untouchable status, was now wrinkled and stained with the stale sweat of a holding cell. She had managed to scrape together a bare minimum bond through a shady bail bondsman, putting up her luxury sedan as collateral. She was free for the moment, but the looming shadow of a federal trial was suffocating her. She knew she needed the most aggressive, expensive defense attorney in the city. She needed a legal miracle to keep her out of a federal penitentiary. She climbed into her car, locking the doors with trembling fingers. She pulled her phone from her purse, taking a deep, uneven breath. She had scheduled a consultation with a high-powered criminal defense lawyer who demanded a massive $50,000 retainer just to review her case files. Diane was not worried about the cost. She still believed she had access to the deep well of my retirement funds. She opened her banking app, typing in her password with frantic, clumsy movements. She navigated to the primary joint checking account, ready to transfer the retainer fee. The screen loaded, and Diane stared at the bright white display in absolute, uncomprehending horror. The balance was completely empty. It read a flat 0. A cold sweat broke out across her forehead. She quickly tapped the screen, switching to our high-yield savings accounts. 0. She checked the investment portfolios, the emergency cash reserves, and the mutual funds. Every single account was completely drained. The numbers stared back at her, mocking her arrogance. There were no frozen assets or pending transfers. The money was simply gone. In that cramped, silent car, the terrifying reality of her situation finally crashed down upon her. She remembered the days I spent quietly visiting physical bank branches, wearing my scuffed work boots, playing the part of a tired old man. I had not been wandering aimlessly. I had been systematically and legally liquidating every single penny of my own hard-earned wealth. I had routed my entire life savings into an impenetrable offshore trust shared only with my father. I had left her with absolutely nothing but the clothes on her back and a mountain of catastrophic legal trouble. Diane frantically dialed the customer service number for the bank, her voice cracking as she demanded to know where the funds had gone. The representative politely informed her that the primary account holder had lawfully closed the accounts days ago. There was no fraud to report on my end. I had simply taken what was rightfully mine and secured it behind a wall of titanium legal protection. Diane dropped her phone onto the passenger seat, letting out a raw, agonizing sob that tore through her throat. She had spent 40 years believing she was the brilliant architect of our family destiny. She thought she could steal my legacy and toss me aside like broken machinery. But now she sat completely destitute in a cold parking lot, facing decades in a federal prison. No luxury attorney would take a complex wire fraud case for free. She was going to have to face the wrath of the federal government, armed with nothing but an overworked public defender. The absolute certainty of her impending ruin settled over her heavy and inescapable. The financial guillotine had finally dropped, and it had severed her from every single comfort she had ever known. The late afternoon sun cast a warm golden glow across the rolling fields of the 50-acre farmhouse. I sat in a heavy wooden rocking chair on the wraparound porch, listening to the gentle rustle of the wind moving through the ancient oak trees. The air was incredibly still and clean. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, my chest was completely free of the heavy, suffocating weight of betrayal. The chaotic storm of lawyers, federal agents, and courtroom tears had finally faded into a distant, silent memory. The toxic infection that had plagued my family for years had been surgically and permanently removed from our lives, leaving behind a profoundly beautiful quiet. I watched a pair of sparrows dart across the clear blue sky, marveling at how different the world looked when you no longer had to constantly guard your own back. I reached over to the small wicker table resting between the chairs and picked up a heavy glass pitcher. The ice cubes clinked softly against the sides as I poured sweet tea into 2 tall glasses. I handed one to my father, George, who was sitting comfortably in the chair beside me. He took the cold glass with steady hands. At 100 years old, he looked remarkably vibrant. The ugly yellow bruise on his temple had completely faded away, leaving behind the rugged, dignified face of a man who had survived a world war and the profound treachery of his own grandson. He took a slow sip of the tea and let out a deep, contented sigh, looking out over the vast expanse of pristine, untouched land. He smiled a genuine, relaxed smile that erased decades of worry from his features. We did not talk about Diane or Brian. There was absolutely nothing left to say about people who had chosen greed over their own flesh and blood. They were currently sitting in cold, sterile holding cells, awaiting a federal trial that would inevitably lock them away for the rest of their natural lives. Their names and their memories had been entirely evicted from this sanctuary. My mind was perfectly at peace, knowing that the wealth I had broken my back to build was locked away securely, shielding my father and me from any future financial storms. The historic soil beneath our feet would never be paved over by a ruthless commercial developer. The legacy of our family remained completely intact, protected by the unyielding iron walls of truth and legal precision. I leaned back in my rocking chair, feeling the smooth, polished wood supporting my tired bones. The sky above the tree line began to explode into brilliant shades of violet and burning orange, painting the clouds with vibrant light. The evening shadows stretched long and comforting across the green grass, welcoming the arrival of the peaceful night. I looked at my father watching the sunset reflect in his clear blue eyes, and I realized that true wealth had nothing to do with bank accounts or corporate titles or country club prestige. true wealth was the absolute quiet of this porch. It was the knowledge that we had stood our ground against the darkest kind of deceit and emerged entirely victorious without sacrificing our integrity. We sat there in the fading light, two men who had weathered the ultimate betrayal, simply drinking our sweet tea and watching the horizon. We were finally safe, entirely secure, and unapologetically free. The greatest lesson this entire ordeal taught me is that true family is not simply determined by blood or marriage certificates, but by unwavering loyalty and mutual respect. We often blind ourselves to the toxic behaviors of those closest to us, because we desperately want to believe in the beautiful illusion of a perfect home. However, ignoring the warning signs out of love only gives greedy individuals the power to destroy everything you have worked so hard to build. True strength lies in having the courage to see people for who they truly are, and making the incredibly difficult choice to protect your peace, even if it means cutting ties with the ones you once held dear. If this story resonated with you, please share your own experiences in the comments below and subscribe to the channel for more stories about surviving betrayal and finding justice.